It's lovely.
Nice to meet you.
It's lovely to be here.
Well, look at this. Guys, this day, immaculate.
It's beautiful.
Just amazing. Well, good morning and welcome. It's Sunday morning, and we're doing something new today, and Tori decided to grace us. For that, I'm going to ask a lot of questions.
Oh, God, no.
Yeah.
I'll do my best.
Anyway.
Shouldn't I be the one asking questions?
We'll see. You can ask and I'll ask. Anyway, I hope you've had a good week and you're having a good Sunday thus far. We finished off last week with last week we were off. But the week before that, we finished the small series on what the earliest Christians believed based on the pre-literary sources that we find in Paul's earliest writings. There we go. Today we're starting something that to me is very interesting, and I hope you're going to find that interesting as well. It's a very small little concept, but it bears with it a lot of meaning. I'm using this small concept as a introduction into how to understand how the Old Testament came to be, specifically the Torah, or something like what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and there's one more and I can't remember Leviticus. So we're starting today with, are there 2 creation accounts in Genesis? Now, obviously the first default answer is no, there's only one, right? And that's been my view for a very, very long time, until I started paying careful attention. The moment I started paying more carefully and being more attentive to what is actually written down, I, instead of just looking for sermons to write about in motivating speeches to write from the scriptures, I started realizing that there's actually so much depth to what's found in the Bible, and it's something that we need to take a little bit more seriously. So when I was discussing this topic with Tori over the weekend, she said, "Frans, but what's the punchline of this series?"
What's the punchline of the fact that there are 2 creation accounts?
I said to Tori, there is no punchline. We're not doing this for a punchline. We're doing it so to bring better understanding of the Bible. Now, being a Christian, the Bible is rather important, right? Do you ever get into any kind of debating? We Christians, we end up with, but the Bible says. So we base everything, on the scriptures that we have. And so getting a proper understanding of them should be rather high on the priority list, but it often isn't, Tori. Often we just use the Bible to confirm what we already believe. We make it say what we want it to say. We're really good at that, and we do it unconsciously almost, or subconsciously. We don't really know we're doing that until someone points it out. So this little exercise in looking at Genesis and seeing if there are in fact 2 Genesis creation accounts is a case in point for reading the Bible more carefully and being honest about what you read in the Bible. Okay, so in order to answer this question, and in the end, I'll give you my opinion and you can make up your own mind about the issue. But we have to talk a little bit about Genesis, right? That's the book. In the first 3 chapters of Genesis, that's where we're going to be focusing. We call this book Genesis. I think it's a Greek title. And we know that Genesis is the first book in the Bible, but it's also the first of what is called the Torah or the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books which we've mentioned. All right, so in order to talk about Genesis, we need to talk about the Pentateuch, or I'm just going to call it the Torah. It's easier to pronounce from now on. Also known as the Law. This was the basis for Jewish belief. And Genesis obviously forms a very, very important part about this, because in Genesis, in the creation accounts, help the Jews to understand where they actually come from. And if you go read nicely, you'll actually see that, we all know this, but the first man, Adam, that's shown there and described, you actually have a lineage for him all the way through to Abraham, all the way through to Jacob. And so the Jews tied themselves to the actual start of the world. That was important to them. And then obviously to their God, the God of the Bible, through these accounts. All right. So, what are the things we need to talk about? Well, we need to talk about Torah in this sense. If we're going to be discussing whether there are two different accounts, we need to talk at least a little bit about who wrote the Torah. Now, traditionally, it's believed, and it was believed by the Jews, and therefore also later by the Christians, because Christians early on were just simply Jews that recognized their Messiah, that Moses, the Moses of Egypt, you don't know about him, go read about him in Exodus, but that he's the author of the entire Torah. In other words, all 5 of those books, which includes, of course, Genesis. And this was the standard belief for a very, very long time. By most Jews, most of the church fathers, early church fathers, the church as a whole, until we reached the Enlightenment and people started thinking differently about the Bible. People started saying, okay, I know you are saying we should believe this, but I'm going to read it for myself, right? And so the fact that the Bible was eventually, in the Reformation, became available to everyone. Later on, people started thinking differently. And so the Bible was one of those things, and actually possibly one of the first things that really came under the scope of scholars to say, okay, now that we have it, and now that we're going to think critically about it, let's take the Bible and we're going to start reading it critically, meaning not with a cynical, critical disposition, but actually more seriously. Like we're gonna read the intricacies of it. We're not just going to brush over it and accept what people have told us about it. So leading this charge was, I guess, the Germans, interestingly enough. And they were really good at it. And so by the time we get to the 20th century, scholarship had pretty much established that they can't just rely on the tradition of Mosaic authorship. They can't just rely on the fact that they've always been told that Moses wrote these books. We need to go look, what do the books themselves say? And then if the books themselves, if they point towards Moses as author, well, then we have some data that we can follow. But that was unfortunately not the result of the scholarship in the 20th century, and it still isn't up until today. And so the scholarship came to a different conclusion based on some reasons, and I'll just mention some of them. But it's pretty important to know that most scholarship today are in a pretty tight consensus, except for very conservative apologists, that Moses didn't write the law, the Pentateuch, and therefore also not Genesis, right? So why is that important? Well, if you know that it most probably wasn't one person that sat down and wrote the whole book of Genesis, then you have to ask the question, who wrote it?
How many people?
How many people wrote it? Was it brought together from different traditions? And so this is the area of critical scholarship. This is what they do all the time. They evaluate the text and see what they can find inside of that. All right, so let me just see. I've got some notes here that I just want to pop into. Genesis, the first book of the 5 books of the Torah, traditionally attributed to Mosaic authorship, but modern scholarship from around the 19th century onward have concluded the books were actually written by various authors. So this is one of the conclusions you'll find today in scholarship, that the books of the Torah and even Genesis was actually written by various and different people between the 10th and the 5th century BC. So Moses would have lived 12th century or even 15th century BC. So 10th century, to give you just a ballpark, it's more or less from where the David kind of starts coming onto the picture. So most scholars agree that the book started coming together, the Torah started coming together after the 10th century, and was probably came to its full redacted version, something very similar to what we have today, around the exile, the exile of the Jews to Babylon, which happened in around the 6th century, right? There are more, some other scholars say even earlier, even later, up until the 4th and even the 3rd century. We're just going to stick to between the 10th and the 5th century. All right, so the point of that is that's quite a long time after Moses, at least 200 to 700 years after Moses. That's rather a long time, which doesn't really give Moses the opportunity to write these books. All right, so it's a long time after Moses lived. All right, so the conclusion is based on several good reasons. a detailed investigation is not what we're doing here, but I just want to mention some of the main points, some of the main reasons why scholars believe that the Pentateuch, the Torah, these first 5 books, the law, which is called the law of Moses, of course, and it's called that even in our New Testament, because they believe that the authorship was Moses, not only because they believe that the law, 10 Commandments, was given to Moses. So here's some of the reasons why they believe that Moses did not write the Torah. And so for this evidence, we don't go to who said what or what the tradition says. They go straight to the actual books and read the books for what they say. Okay, so here's some of the 6 reasons. Number 1, the Torah is mainly written in the third person past tense. In other words, it makes it obvious that it's someone writing in the future back into the past. It itself makes no claim that it was written by Moses. So it's not like Moses writes and says, hello, I am Moses, this is what happened. Or at the end, sign off by saying, and this is what Moses, and this is me, Moses, writing something down for you. In fact, the book speaks about Moses as if he is another person. It speaks about his death, etc., etc. There's a couple of reasons there. So that's the second one. The third one is that in the Torah we find information that reflects a time well beyond that of Moses. In other words, this is a anachronistic, not error, but the text is anachronistic, and meaning this, that it is written in a time where certain things exist that did not exist in the beginning, but the author would not have known that. So we include some things from his own context, giving away that he's not writing back in the day, but from a later period. The Torah assumes incorrectly that conditions present at the time of its writing were also present in the ancient time. This is a related point. It makes the same type of argument. There are numerous doublets that are present in the Torah. And this suggests, well, let me first explain what a doublet is. Sorry, doublet. Doublet is 2 things that are very similar but different within the book. We're going to be talking about them a little bit more extensively before we start. But it's a very important concept. The question is, why would an author write something twice and write it down differently and so many times? And sometimes, and here's the main point, is that sometimes these things, they're very hard to harmonize, and sometimes they actually contradict each other. And that the simplest explanation for that is, it's not the same person that wrote both those little things. In fact, doublets is actually the main theme of what we're doing. We're asking whether there are 2 Genesis accounts, right? What doublets do suggest is that you have various, or at least then for a doublet, 2 traditions coming in to a redactor that takes both the traditions in and places them in this one book. It does seem like ancient authors were more concerned with preserving different traditions than trying to create one unified tradition. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done things like put the book of Chronicles and the book of 1 Samuel and Kings into the Hebrew canon, because it's a retelling of the story of David, but with some very different information. They don't unify that and say, no, we need to reject one or reject the other. They say we put both in because they're both important to us. It does seem like the differences is not a problem for them. They just want to preserve the tradition accurately. And if they have 2 traditions that they deem valuable, they're not going to throw one out. All right, we see this, for instance, even in our Gospels. Why don't we just have one Gospel that's the right one with all the right information? The people that decided on the biblical canon, they said, look, these are different at points. Some of them have this, some of them don't have this. Some of them are very hard to harmonize. Other places, they seem to even contradict each other. So are we going to throw out the 3 and keep the one we think is most accurate? No, definitely not. We keep all of them because they're all valuable. They're different vantage points of the same thing. So it seems like the ancient writers of the Torah did, basically the redactors, they did the same thing. They took the various traditions and they put them in together. And this is the reason why so often we have these doublets in the Old Testament, in the Torah, and also in Genesis. And this is one of the proofs or one of the lines of evidence that give us an idea that one person didn't write this. It seems just so unlikely that
Yeah.
someone would write something twice in that way. And when we investigate some of these doublets, you'll realize that it's improbable, right? Okay, so that was number 5. Number 6 is also a pretty persuasive one. Is that the Hebrew in which the Torah was written, at least the copies we have, comes from a type of Hebrew that exists during the 2nd millennium BC. In other words, from the 10th century on, and that's long after Moses lived, right? So it reflects a Hebrew that did not exist in the time of Moses. So this is linguistically how they also date what is found in the Torah. So those are just 6 quick reasons why most scholars today believe that when you hold your Old Testament, when you hold the Torah, the law, those 5 books in your hand, you're not holding something that was written by one person. You're holding something that is a complex literary work that comes from many different traditions, and that at some point someone sat down and said, bring that, yes, we want that, let's put that in here. Let's put that before that. Let's structure it so that it makes sense. We're going to have a look at some of the structures in Genesis in a moment. That seems to be the work of a later redactor, trying to make sense of the order of things and put it into a literary work that's got nice chapters and etc. So that someone who reads it can make sense of it. All right, so the Pentateuch was not authored out of whole cloth by a 2nd millennium BCE Moses, but it is the end product of a complex literary process, written, oral, or even both of them, that did not come to a close until post-exilic. So most scholars today believe that in and by the time of the end of the exile, that's where we kind of get the final redaction, the bringing together of these books, in a time in which Israel was trying to make sense of what has happened to us. We're out of our land. We don't have a Jerusalem. Has God forsaken us? No, we are his people. This is how we connect back into our history. And in that way, this is how Judaism became a religion of the book. Other religions, pagan religions, they don't have central scriptures so much. At least the other Mesopotamian and the Greco-Roman religions, they're not religions of a book. But Judaism is the religion of the Torah. And so Christianity, of course, also that came out of it, also became, here we are talking about an ancient book, right? All right. So, as said before, in the 20th century, scholars sat and they started analyzing the Torah, trying to find out, okay, if it is not one person that wrote this, there's possibility that there's many traditions coming together. Is there a way in which we can analyze the text, analyze the books, the portions, the stories, to recognize different traditions that have been weaved together? So this seems to be a very, very difficult task, but these scholars have done an amazing job, and they came up with a theory in the 20th century, or it might have been actually, 20th century, called the 4-document hypothesis. And it's a hypothesis, it's a theory, in which they identified like 4 main streams of traditions that have come together. Right? It's 4 main. There might be others, but these are the 4 main. And so these 4 are called, and I've got them written down here for you. I'm just mentioning so you know more or less. The first one they recognized was the Yahwist tradition from the 9th century BCE in the kingdom of Judah. In other words, from the southern part of the kingdom of Israel. Then the second one is the Elohist from the 8th century BCE, and that comes from the northern tribes, from northern Israel. The third one is from the 7th century, and this comes into being during the religious reforms of King Josiah. And then lastly, we have a priestly source that writes during the Babylonian exile in the 5th century BCE. All right, so more or less, these are the 4 main sources, and you can actually buy books. And I would encourage, if you're interested in this or want to have more information on this, you can actually read about the documentary hypothesis. The way that they analyze the data is pretty convincing that there's multiple sources working. Of course, as scholarship progressed today, the original form of this hypothesis is no longer accepted. They've made later additions to it, and it's been modified. And that's the great thing about scholarship. It can change according to the data. But the basic premise that it's multiple authors, multiple streams of sources that come together, that seems to be quite in a that seems to be the consensus of most scholars. Okay, so then to the creation accounts in Genesis. So knowing this now, and not just accepting the tradition that Moses wrote Genesis, we have to also consider that Moses didn't write Genesis 1 to 3, right? That he is not the one who actually pinned that down. And that then, therefore, there's a possibility that when you ask a question, are there two creation accounts? There is that possibility for the first time. So now you have to go beyond it not being possible to let's go and have a look at the text. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing here. The question is, who wrote? Who wrote these accounts then? Well, we'll probably never know, but this information allows us to look at the Torah and Genesis, and specifically the creation accounts, in a very new light. It was not necessarily written by one author. We might be able to find then in these doublets within the scripture that result from the inclusion of multiple traditions and forms and stories of a particular story within the text. And if in fact this is what we will, and in fact this is exactly what we find in the Torah. And so one of the main reasons, as we mentioned earlier, that scholars believe that we have multiple authors is the presence of so many of these doublets, right? There is a list of about 31 that I could find in the Old Testament. Wow. Now that's rather comprehensive.
Sure.
And it is not, these doublets do not concern peripheral information. Some of the doublets, we'll mention in a moment, look at it a little bit closer, is, for instance, the Ten Commandments is found in 3 places, and they're not exactly the same. So you've got to ask, why is this, etc. Okay, so it seems like they've been spliced together. They've been splicing together several duplicates within the text. So sometimes the information in the duplet can be considered as complementary. In other words, they say the same thing, just in different words. Other times, they're really hard to harmonize. We'll list some examples now. And there are exceptional, well, not exceptional, but there are certain examples where they contradict each other and you don't know what to do with them because they're not saying the same type of thing. All right. So I've highlighted just 4 of the doublets, that I want to mention here today, just as an example of some of these that we find in the Old Testament. And I think most of these are actually in the Torah. In the Torah. And some of them are specifically in Genesis. So the first one that I want to mention is the Ten Commandments. And this is actually a triplet. There's actually 3 of these in the Old Testament. 2 of them are very similar, and then 1 is completely strange. It doesn't list the 10 commandments, it lists other commandments, but then mentions that it is still written down on the tablets. So it's a little bit strange. Let's put that one aside today and let's deal with the 2 that's rather similar. So in the 2 that's rather similar, let me just start by saying this. This is what you would expect if you have an ancient book and different traditions coming together. But the claim that we as Christians make of the Bible is not just that it is good information or beautiful information. We make the claim that it's inspired by God, right? And that every word, or this is the claim that most Christians make. I don't make this claim anymore, that it has to be 100% correct all the time. So we're setting a really high bar for what we would expect. Now, when you're talking about something like the 10 Commandments, story that was etched in stone. You don't have a pen and paper you can quickly change and mark. It's etched in stone. So in other words, it's what's the English word?
Engraved.
Engraved in stone. That's not an easy process. It's a lengthy process. So we got a bit of a lump. Right. Yeah, it's not that easy to do that. But the point I'm trying to make is you would expect the 10 Commandments
There's only one
to
version.
be exactly the same,
wherever it's mentioned.
not only in idea, but in actual words, in actual spelling. It is something that God tells Moses to write down. Like you're not expecting different versions, right? So
it's not. It wasn't. He didn't come down and say, "God told me this," and do it verbally.
Oh, yeah, no, he etched
which
them
could
in.
be broken down telephone. But this is on stone.
Anyway, the point is that in 2 of these doublets, we find the 10 Commandments very similar, But in some of them, you are not words added, like the command not to covet. In one of them, and I'll mention them in a moment. There's you're not allowed to covet a field is added to one where it's not present in the other. Oh, and that's what's that? That's nothing. Yeah, it would be nothing if we didn't make the claim that this is the actual words of God, and now people are going to fight for the rest of eternity on whether the field is included in the coveting. But one of the major differences between the two that's very similar is the reason for the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is obviously something that makes the Jews unique. They have many things similar to other pagan religions of their time, Mesopotamian and also later Greco-Roman. But one of the things that make them very unique is this idea of a seventh-day rest, right? Okay, so let's just get to the notes here. So the first one is found in Exodus 20, verse 1 to 17, and the second one is found in Deuteronomy 5, verse 6 to 18. So in Exodus 20, in the Exodus 20 version, the Sabbath day is for rest because God rested on the seventh day after creating for 6 days, and he made the Sabbath day holy. Right? So it says you have to honor the Sabbath day and you have to rest, and the reason is because God rested on the seventh day, basically. But in Deuteronomy, things have changed by this time. Deuteronomy is quite a bit later than Exodus, the Exodus version. And by this time, a different reason is given for the rest. Here, the rest is given to remember that they have always been slaves, and to remember the slaves that are now amongst them, and to make sure that those slaves also get a rest day. All right, so once again here, it's not a major difference. It's a motivational difference. And if it was any other book, we'd say, well, we can, it's not an issue. But when it is such a important theological thing, you would expect it to be the same. Anyway, the point is these two are different, and they are understood to come from two different traditions. That's why they are slightly different. The second tradition was more concerned with the slaves around them. The first tradition was more concerned with the holiness of the Sabbath. All right. So that's the first example of a doublet in the Old Testament. The second one is one that you might never have really noticed as a Christian, thought nothing of it, but maybe after today that will change. And this is the genealogy of Adam. Now, when we get to Genesis 4, verse 17 to 26, we find a genealogy of Adam, and then that stops. And lo and behold, as it stops, the genealogy of Adam starts again. And there's another genealogy of Adam, this time including the years of each person's life. Now, you know that the Genesis account have these guys living for literally centuries. But it's so strange that a single author would have two genealogies, one with dates, one with years and one without years, and put them right next to each other. It just doesn't make sense. You would think that a single author would just write them with all the information in them and have one set available for their readers. So once again, it's a doublet. I haven't, not even in preparation for this, had a look to see whether there's differences in them. But that's beyond the point anyway. The point is just this type of evidence tends to show us, and it's one line of evidence, that is many authors' work that comes together, and the redactor said, I'm keeping both, and keeps both of them. So that's the second one. The third one is a very interesting one, and this is the flood account. The flood account you can find in Genesis 7, and it goes through to, I think, to the end of chapter 8. And maybe go read it again after today, and just go see there what you find, because the other doublets we've mentioned are either scattered or far apart, kept in different books, or like the Adam genealogy, they put consecutively after each other. But the Genesis doublet seems to be weaved with itself. In other words, the author took both of the accounts and kind of weaved them together. When the one speaks about Noah's life, then he would add the other one's portion of Noah's life before he starts with how many flood days or what type of animals should have been taken, animals taken, flood days. So it seems like a weaving of the information. Go look at it for yourself. But here is one of the cases where the information seems contradictory, like you can't reconcile the information that's given in both of these. So this is an indication to scholars that we have two accounts of which the redactors believed we need to keep both, but they were a little bit creative with how they put them together. So, for instance, in Genesis 7, verse 2 to 4, Manoah is instructed to take 7 pairs of all the clean animals and a pair of the unclean beasts. It's 1 pair, so no mistake there. 7 pairs of all the unclean of all the clean animals, and a pair, 2 animals of all the 7 pairs of all the clean beasts, and 1 pair of all the unclean beasts, right? And also of the birds, to take 7 pairs of each bird, right? For in 7 days it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights. The other version, just a little bit, 4 verses later, in chapter 7, verse 8, he says, of all the clean and unclean beasts and the birds, 1 pair. Put them in. All right, so you can't reconcile that.
Yeah.
There's no maths that will work here. 2 different traditions weave together. But also in verse 24, and the waters grew strong on the earth for 150 days. Different amount of days, right? Okay, so quite clear here we're dealing with 2 different traditions. We're not pulling our hair out our head. Christians prefer the 2 pairs of each, and the only story I heard as a child is 2 of each animal and 40 days. Well, in fact, that is actually a blending of 2 different stories that we've always been told. The point here is this is an example that there are different information getting weaved together. Okay. Finally is our case in point, the creation account. And in fact, creation accounts, they seem to be 2 of them as well. They put consecutively right next to each other with a little middle we'll speak about. But they seem to be very different. And now that we know that there are these doublets right throughout the Old Testament, we can for the first time say, okay, so most probably one person didn't write these 2 accounts, and it's not one story, right? Or it's not a single person who wrote them. And possibly we have been dealing with doublets in the New Testament, in the Old Testament or in the Torah. So there is a possibility that we are dealing with 2
Doublets,
different traditions. So the last thing to do then is to see, what does the information in them look like? Are they reconcilable or harmonizable? Are they things that look like they're contradictory? And that's what we're going to be doing in this session. So today, to finish off, I just want to briefly say something about the structure of the book of Genesis. So, as you might not know, the book of Genesis was not written with actual chapters. Chapter 1, chapter 2, verse 3. That's something we later on added in there. But there does seem to be a literary structure to the book of Genesis. And once again, it's not something we pull out of thin air. It's something we find in the book of Genesis itself. Okay, so keeping in mind that the chapter divisions we have today for the book of Genesis, chapters 1 to 37, it wasn't originally there. We do have traces of an earlier structure for the book within the book itself. In other words, an original structure. The phrase, these are the generations, remember that phrase, appears to be the redactor's way of dividing the book up into sections of importance. So it seems like every time there's a change in idea or we're moving on in timeline, he starts with, and these are the generations of, and then tells the story of a particular person. Most of them are orientated towards the important characters in the book of Genesis. This phrase seems to divide the book into clear, logical, generational sections. The phrase appears 11 times, and one of the times seems to be in the generations of Esau, a little bit of a re-mentioning, but it appears 9 times for people. And then the last one is the one we want to be talking about. So basically what you have in the book of Genesis, it'll say, and these are the generations of Adam. And then it will talk about Adam. And then it goes on. That's Genesis 5 verse 1. Then it goes on to in Genesis 6 verse 9. It says, and these are the generations of Noah. Then it tells the Noah story. In Genesis 11:10, these are the generations of the sons of Noah. It tells the story of what they are. Genesis 11:27, these are the generations of Shem. So that's 11:10. 11:27, these are the generations of Terah, who was the father of Abraham. Genesis 25:13, these are generations of Ishmael. Genesis 25:19, Isaac. Genesis 36:9, Esau. And then Genesis 37:2, Jacob. Jacob being Israel. And so basically what you have is you have these chapter divisions that ties Israel, the nation, back to Adam, the first man, according to the book, right? So you have them perfectly put in place. But there's one more that I didn't mention, and in fact, this is the very first one. But the first one doesn't appear at the beginning of the book. The first one appears appears between these two creation accounts, splitting them nicely in the middle for us. And you would think that the actual generation, it's called, and these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. So this is how Genesis is laid out. The generations of the heavens and the earth, generations of Adam, Noah, sons of Noah, Shem, all creation account before that. That doesn't start like that. So this is already a very interesting development for us when we just look at the natural structure of the book of Genesis. Two creation stories split by basically a chapter heading, according to the original author. Now, once again, the original authors or the redactors, they did not seem to want to hide doublets. They wanted to preserve tradition. And it seems by virtue of that this is another indicator for us is let's look closely then to the two accounts that braces this chapter heading in the book of Genesis. So I've basically explained all of that. Okay, so considering the structure of the book of Genesis as discussed above, we'll start our investigation with the creation account that starts after the heading, because it seems natural that might have been the original one that follows nicely with everything else, and that the first one might have been the one that was added in later. It just so turns out, just running ahead of ourselves a little bit, most scholars believe that the first one was in fact added later, and that the second one is the one that was the earlier version of the creation account. So we're going to be starting then with the second one. The second one starts in Genesis 2 verse 4 and runs all the way to Genesis 3 verse 24. And we're going to be, next session, we're going to dedicate to that one. We're going to walk through it as slowly as we can. We're going to read it plainly. We're going to ask critical questions. We're not going to just assume the things everyone has told us.
Yeah.
We want to look at specifically the order of creation. We want to look at God's temperament, God's nature. How is God portrayed? The name of God. What about Adam and Eve? When does the woman come? Why is the woman made? When do God make the beasts of the field? Etc., etc., etc. And when we're done with that one, we're going to jump back to the first one. The first one it is different. You can go look for yourself. The first one is more of, let me not get into it, but we're going to ask the same questions of the first one that we asked of the second one, and then we'll end off by comparing them and putting forth this as a motivation, basically, or at least a case for, in order to try and answer the question. You can answer it for yourself, whether there is in fact a doublet present in the creation accounts. All right, so that's it for today. We're going to stop there. So what I would suggest is, if you have a bit of extra time and you are interested in the Bible, that you go and read Genesis 1 to Genesis 3 slowly. Look for the chapter heading inclusion that we've mentioned. These are the generations. Ask critical questions of this creation account. Do the same things appear? Do they appear in the same order? Are there possible contradictions? What is Adam like in the one? Etc. Read it for what it says. It's the most difficult thing you can ever do with the Bible is to read it for what it says, because your context, your tradition, your history overclouds everything you're reading, so that you're almost always interpreting according to your own context. Anyway, so have a wonderful Sunday. We'll see you next week. We're diving into the first one. Cheers.
Bye.